He has been actively advocating for media and prosecution reform in Korea since his election as a member of National Assembly. He has also been a strong supporter of peace on the Korean Peninsula. 김용민 의원님, 축사 부탁드리겠습니다.
안녕하십니까. 대한민국 국회의원 김용민입니다. 미국의 신냉전 정책과 한반도와 동북아시아 전쟁 위기 웨비나 개최를 진심으로 축하드립니다. 노엄 촘스키 교수님은 대표적인 진보 지식인으로 이전에 한반도 종전선언을 지지하셨으며 한반도 평화에도 관심을 많이 보이고 계신 것으로 알고 있습니다. 이번 웨비나로 촘스키 교수님의 고견을 들을 수 있게 돼서 영광입니다. 한편 촘스키 교수님은 저랑도 간단한 개인적인 인연이 있었는데요. 박근혜 오촌 살인사건, 박근혜 대통령 오촌 살인사건에 제가 변호인으로 참여했을 때 촘스키 교수님께서 김어준, 주진우 두 분에게 탄원서를 써서 주셨던 적이 있습니다. 그래서 그런 개인적인 인연도 있어서 오늘 더욱 뜻깊은 자리인 것 같습니다. 자리를 마련해 주신 심원천 박사님께도 감사의 인사 전합니다. 아울러 참석해 주신 모든 분들 너무 반갑습니다. 불확실성의 시대입니다. 미국과 중국의 힘겨루기는 기존의 판을 뒤흔들고 있습니다. 미국은 인플레이션 감축법을 무기처럼 휘두르고 있고 강력한 보호무역주의로 패권 경쟁을 심화시키고 있습니다. 일본 역시 무시할 수 없는 변수가 됐습니다. 최근 일본은 평화헌법 구조를 무력화하면서 군비 증강을 강행하고 있습니다. 군비 경쟁에 불을 붙임으로써 동북아의 위기를 고조시키고 있는 중입니다. 군비 경쟁에 순응한다라고 하면 과도한 국방비 지출 및 우발적 충돌 문제 등 다양한 문제에 직면할 수밖에 없습니다. 그래서 진정 평화를 위한다라면 머리를 맞대고 호혜적 관계를 형성할 수 있는 방법론을 이제는 논의해야 할 때입니다. 오늘의 웨비나가 의미 있는 시작이 될 것이라고 믿습니다. 자신만의 전략이 없으면 다른 이의 전략의 일부가 된다라고 합니다. 이번 웨비나를 통해서 복잡 다단한 안보 경쟁의 문제를 해결하고 분석해서 불확실성의 시대를 헤쳐나갈 전략을 마련할 수 있기를 기대합니다. 이것은 앞으로 한반도가 나아가야 될 방향이 될 것이라고 생각합니다. 다시 한번 이 웨비나 참석해 주신 모든 분들께 감사의 인사를 전합니다. 감사합니다.
Now I would like to introduce our moderator for this evening, Dr. Simon Chun. Dr. Chun is a researcher in U.S. foreign policy in Korean Peninsula. Dr. Chun serves on the executive board of Korea Policy Institute and the advisory board of Code Pink. From now on, Dr. Chun will lead the conversation. Hello, Dr. Chun.
Thank you, Karen, for an excellent opening. And before I take the microphone to the speaker and also discussing, I'd like to just provide some very brief context for today's webinar. As you know, South Korea's far-right President Yoon, who was elected just last year by a narrowest margin of 0.7%, is in Washington, D.C. this week and for a state visit at the invitation of President Biden. Yoon's visit comes at a time when South Korea is experiencing unprecedented crisis on the political, economic, and national security front as a consequence of the Biden administration's unrelenting pressure on South Korea to join the U.S. anti-China bloc. And Washington's policies run directly counter to the sentiment of the majority of South Koreans who strongly support balanced foreign relations with Russia and China, meaningful reconciliation with Japan, and most importantly, peace with North Korea. As you know, according to the recent polls, 80% of Koreans oppose the degree to which President Yoon has capitulated to Washington's imposition of its anti-China policy on South Korea. And Washington's endorsement of Yoon and its support for his new national security directly contravenes the majority of South Korean public opinion. According to recent polls, the Yoon administration has 19% approval rating. So to sum up, while the purpose of Yoon's state visit is to prove his relevance to many of us, to U.S. imperial ambitions in Asia, Washington's increasingly heavy-handed management of its one-sided relationship with South Korea is causing to lose the battle for the hearts and minds among the South Korean public. Just to help make sense of these grave issues from a critical geopolitical perspective and also activist perspective, without further ado, I would like to pass the microphone to Professor Chomsky.
Well, South Korean opinion happens to be lining up with the great majority of the world. Most of the world is refusing to support the U.S. effort to launch a major new Cold War, both in Europe and in Asia. Even in Europe, you look at public opinion polls, a large majority oppose the policy of rejecting the effort for a negotiated diplomatic settlement, which comes from Washington and is followed by most of the European leadership, not all. Most of the world just says, no, it's not our fight. We do not want to join in the conflict with either Russia or certainly not with China. And in fact, China has been moving towards infuriating the United States by moving towards initiating peaceful settlements of major conflicts. The Saudi Arabia-Iran case is a dramatic one, throws a wrench into long-standing U.S. policy to try to organize an alliance of reactionary states for its conflict with Iran. Saudi Arabia, a linchpin. Saudi Arabia has even joined the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, China-based development and investment program. The United States has tried and so far succeeded in getting the European leadership, I say, to join in its what in fact should be regarded as a preparation for war with China. The last NATO summit, the United States rammed through a condition that NATO be expanded to the Indo-Pacific region. So the North Atlantic now includes South Korea, in case you didn't notice. All of the Pacific and Indian Ocean region must be part of the NATO system run by the United States, of course, an aggressive alliance. Most of the world is refusing. The United States is developing the impending attack on China. It's not impending, it's already underway at two levels. One is military, one is economic. The military dimension is things like expanding NATO, but concretely in official terminology, I'll just quote the official terminology, encircling China with a ring of sentinel states, including South Korea, leading all the way to Japan, Australia, that are armed with, heavily armed with U.S. advanced precision weapons aimed at China. The United States has now expanded this by, for the first time, sending permanent B-52, that's nuclear capable B-52 installations in Guam in Northern Australia, now moving toward the Philippines, try to create that the military dimension is to the sending of nuclear submarines to Australia, which is intended as part of the method for bottling up China so that it can't get access to the Pacific. Because the subs, in fact, even the existing ones, are now carrying out sabotage in the Chinese International Economic Zone, monitoring Chinese shipping and so on. All of that is part of the military dimension. On the economic dimension, it's perfectly open and frank. The Secretary of Commerce, Gina Raimondo, just said that all Western countries must cooperate in preventing Chinese innovation and development. China must somehow be strangled. Or any component, if you look at the supply chains for advanced technology like chips, they're very widespread. There's almost nothing that doesn't contain some kind of U.S. component, a patent, a piece, or whatever. And the Biden administration rules, expanding Trump even further, are that no ally, including South Korea, can send anything to China that includes a U.S. component, which means about everything. It's a severe threat against South Korea, the Netherlands, Japan, all of which have highly advanced industries. You know about South Korea, I don't have to tell you, but Netherlands has the leading lithographic industry, which makes minuscule components that are critical to development of computer chips. The Netherlands is being ordered by the United States to leave the China market, which is, of course, an enormously lucrative market. It's not clear yet whether they'll submit to this. It's part of the deindustrialization of Europe that's being carried out under U.S. auspices by trying to cut Europe off from its natural markets in the East. Russia's enormous mineral reserves, oil reserves, and the enormous China market right behind it. The European allies are partially submitting to this, partially refusing. At the G7 meetings, all opposed the U.S. efforts to expand the sanctions against Russia to the point where all exports are banned. Only the United States supported that, the entire G7 approved. So there is a struggle going on in the West, but in the rest of the world, there's no struggle. Nobody wants this. Every country is moving towards independence of the US-dominated global system. Brazil, India, Indonesia, South Africa, they're all moving towards independent financial, commercial relations with China or even with each other that don't involve a third party, meaning US currency and control. This is a development worldwide. It's a major conflict for development of world order. South Korea is right in the middle of it. The crisis is the question of whether to move towards some kind of political commercial settlement with the North is primary consideration. It has to be accomplished, or else both Koreas suffer badly in the world as well. It's, I think, can be. There have been moves that came close to it, which were undermined. We could go into that, but now it's an imperative, and there must be a united front to evade the enormous U.S. effort to try to create the basis for a major conflict with China, which will be devastating. I mean, they're now talking, even U.S. generals who ought to know better are talking about the possibility of a war with China. It's total insanity. War with China, everybody's finished. It's done. Human race is finished. A couple of people survive. You might remember Albert Einstein's answer to the question, what weapons will be used in the Third World War? He said, I don't know what weapons will be used in the Third World War, but the Fourth World War, it'll be stone axes. Yeah, that's basically correct. This loose talk of the same. I mean, you find articles in the major U.S. journal, Foreign Affairs, major journal, saying, oh, we can have a small nuclear war with Russia, just tactical nuclear weapons won't hit the United States. Who cares? It's beyond insanity. As soon as you begin to move up the escalation ladder, there's no point where it stops. If anybody's in trouble, they'll just escalate. It's elementary. Every war game shows it. Everybody who can think for a minute can figure it out. There is no conceivable possibility of a major war among nuclear powers. It goes beyond that, much beyond. We're all of us, everyone on the planet is facing major crises. We're destroying the environment. We have a couple of decades, literally, in which we can deal with the heating, boiling of the environment. You don't do it, we go down the road to essentially destruction of organized human society. That's quite clear. Either the major powers will accommodate in some way to deal with this crisis, which has no borders, of course, nor do others. Either they'll find a way to work together to deal with it, or we'll all go to disaster together. It's as simple as that. The direction in which leadership is going there's no word for it. It's beyond criminal. It's beyond any words that I know. It's leading to the potential, very likely, destruction of organized human life on Earth. And eyes open, they're doing it. Got to stop this, shift dramatically from confrontation to accommodation at every level, whether it's North and South Korea, US and China, Europe and Russia. It's got to go in that direction, or we're all going to go off the precipice together.
I mean, the key point that I wanted to make is South Korea has exercised full operational control of its military for only 13 months since its liberation in 1945. That is to say, 78 years ago, it's only controlled its own military for about a little over a year. It's still subject to US wartime operational control. That means the US has de facto and de jure control over 600,000 plus Korean troops, highly trained, highly armed, plus 3.1 reservists, and all of South Korea's bases, weapons, and material at the drop of a hat. This constitutes an incredibly powerful force projection platform and major force multiplier for the US. And as Professor Chomsky has pointed out, and as we already know, South Korea has always been a subcontractor to US geopolitical design. It was the first to volunteer troops to Vietnam. It deployed 320,000 troops to Vietnam. South Korea's Indo-Pacific strategy is essentially the US Indo-Pacific strategy handed back to the United States on a silver platter. And now the US is preparing for war against China, and it's using tension against North Korea as a stalking horse or a pretext for escalation against China and military enmeshment between Japan and Korea and the US. And it is deliberately provoking and stoking tension with nonstop military exercises and provocations. So my question is, can we have any good outcomes, diplomacy, peace, reunification, when first the US is still violating the original conditions of the military armistice between North Korea and the United States, and when South Korea does not have sovereign control over its own military? That is to say, its military is simply an appendage of US force projection and US geopolitical design. And the US clearly has an interest in containing, militarizing, and escalating towards kinetic war.
No,
With regard to Korea, the major step has to be to move towards a peace treaty, as North Korea has been requesting for a long time. U.S. has been rejecting it. As long as there's no peace treaty between the South and the North, South Korea is occupied. That's a fact. South Korea is an occupied country, as you describe, and in the absence of a peace treaty will remain so. It's in the interest of all the people of Korea, all, to move towards a peace agreement. And there's every reason to believe that that's possible. It came quite close in the past. 2006, for example, there was actually an agreement under major pressure from Asian countries. The US, the Bush administration, second Bush, was pressured to enter into negotiations with North Korea. They reached an agreement, 2006, in which North Korea agreed to terminate all missile nuclear programs in exchange for a peace agreement, no hostile acts, offer of a light reactor for medical purposes. It was all agreed. Bush administration immediately undermined it, rejected, dismantled the consortium that was going to provide the nuclear reactor, immediately carried out hostile acts accusing Korea of all sorts of North Korea of all kinds of things. So of course, North Korea went back to building up its missile and nuclear capacities. In fact, as some of the leading U.S. historians of Korea, like Leon Siegel, have been pointing out, North Korea has been following what he calls a tit-for-tat policy. You carry out aggressive acts, we'll respond with aggressive acts. Not saying it's a nice regime. It isn't by any means, but that's a different question. There have been possibilities for moving towards reconciliation, many. They can. That's the local issue. It's much broader. I mean, right now, just today, in fact, the Republican House of Representatives was presented with legislation to punish the Solomon Islands for daring to move towards some kind of reconciliation. Nothing is left open. I don't know if Washington will do it, but it's no. And most of the world is finding ways out of this, like the BRICS countries, which now have a larger economy than Europe and the United States, almost twice as much, in fact. Major region are moving towards independent means of commercial and trade interactions, not working through Washington. Notice that, as you know, of course, the United States is basically the only country in the world that can impose sanctions. And everyone has to obey the sanctions, third-party sanctions, whether they like it or not, because the U.S. controls the international financial system. Well, there's that, and there are now efforts to break out of that domination. BRICS has a development bank, which is probably going to be more active than the World Bank. The U.S., incidentally, is barely funding the World Bank, doesn't want international institutions. It's all of these things are taking place all over the world, including Europe. And South Korea has an opportunity to join in this growing tendency to move towards a multipolar world. I should make a comment here about the way discourse is constructed in the United States. There's a confrontation between two versions of world order. One is the UN-based world order, which is proposed by China, by the global South, by most of the world. The U.S. is opposed. It's in favor of what's called a rules-based international order. And doctrinal controls are so rigid in the United States, free society, but very rigid doctrinal controls by submission, not force. Everyone has to talk about a rules-based order. What's a rules-based order? It's an order in which the United States sets the rules. And if it doesn't like the rules, it throws them out. So when the World Trade Organization tries to reach to join other judicial organizations in condemning the U.S. sanctions that are strangling Cuba. The Clinton administration just says, sorry, it's none of your business. We have a policy to overthrow the government, said that openly, and you, the World Trade Organization, have no right to interfere with this by charging that our sanctions regime violates the rules. We set the rules. You don't like it? Too bad. Same just happened with the World Trade Organization condemning U.S. stealing basically the reserves from Iran. World Trade Organization tried to block it, said it's illegal. The United States told them, get lost. We do what they like. That's the rules-based order. If you're an American academic or political commentator, you got to talk about the rules-based order. The rest of the world's talking about a UN-based order. Well, that's a multipolar versus a unipolar world. South Korea has its choices. It's not going to be easy. As you say, for all of South Korea's existence, it's been subordinated to the United States. Actually, if you take a look back at the amazing economic development of South Korea, which is quite astonishing, as you know, had a big shot in the arm from South Korean participation in the Vietnam War. A huge flow of income came to South Korea from joining in devastating, destroying rural South Vietnam. Lots of atrocities, lots of murders, but plenty of money coming. So there's a kind of a gain in a way, but now South Korea is paying the price. Do you want to stay subordinated to the United States or join most of the rest of the world in moving towards a global order with independent centers of control, not just the United States? Does South Korea want to be part of the North Atlantic? Well, it's a decision. According to the United States, South Korea is part of the North Atlantic. That was the last NATO summit. It's an issue that will have to be resolved in South Korea. It's not going to be easy. It won't be easy for Samsung to say, we're not going to abandon the Chinese market the way you're trying to make us do. Be a big blow to Samsung and the South Korean industry. Same question arising in the Netherlands and Japan. Not at all clear how they're going to deal with it. It's in fact, even U.S. corporations are being subjected by the government to efforts to undermine them by blocking their China trade. So far, they're finding ways to evade it. But this is a major issue all over the world. It's quite interesting to watch how it's playing out.
I wanted to just start by saying today is a very significant day with the Biden and Yoon summit in Washington, D.C., where, as many of you may know, President Yoon has been toying with the idea of developing South Korea's own nuclear weapons program and allegedly has broad support in South Korea because of North Korea's increasing missile tests and nuclear capability. And as a way to assuage South Korea, they announced, President Biden announced that they would be sending the U.S. nuclear-armed submarines to be docked in South Korea, which I think is quite terrifying and is very provocative against North Korea, against China.
Japan makes sure that its children and general public stay uninformed about its imperial past by censoring the country's textbooks. Japan continues to deny its responsibility for the division of Korea and the Korean War, which brought huge profits to the Japanese economy. Today, Japan maintains its hostility towards the DPRK and has no intention to atone for the colonial past and resume diplomatic relations. Japan does not miss any chance to get in the way of any peace process in the Korean Peninsula by weaponizing the abduction issue. The Japanese government and the pro-Japan, pro-US Korean government collaborate in bringing humiliating so-called solutions to victims of colonial time forced labor and sex slavery with the pressure from the US.
Theodore Roosevelt handed Korea over to Japan as part of what he got the Nobel Prize for peace. The Japanese were considered, the South Africans had a phrase, they called them honorary whites. They're not really Asians, they just kind of look like that. But the Japanese are honorary whites. The US treated them that way too. There's plenty of racial prejudice behind all of this. And the Japanese were partially excluded from it, except during the Second World War itself. But these are major issues. For South Korea, it means problems are internal there. For Japan, it's a major problem to educate the Japanese people to maintain Article 9, the formal peace position, which is being seriously eroded, may even be overthrown formally by the right-wing government. That's a struggle that's going to go on in Japan. Unfortunately, there's not very much of it, some, not much. But we can only hope through international solidarity to support the movements in our own country and other countries which have the common aim of saving human life on Earth, to create a livable world instead of a world in which we'll all be destroyed by conflict. That's the task of this generation, which can't be avoided.
Thank you so much, Simon and organizers. I'm really want to express my gratitude to Prof. Noam Chomsky to consistently supporting the people in Jeju fighting against the Jeju Navy base by this chance. Jeju, located close to China, has been considered as the strategic spot for powerful nations throughout history. It can be either an outpost for war or a hub for world peace. The naval base on Jeju was unfortunately constructed in 2016, despite the people's opposition, but the struggle continues. The Jeju Navy base is a South Korean base, but according to the terms of the US-ROK Mutual Defense Treaty in 1953, the United States can use the South Korean military base and facilities anytime it wants. David Suchta of the US Navy wrote in 2013 that the Jeju Naval Base could support Japan in a conflict with China over the Senkaku Islands, as well as during a conflict in the Taiwan Strait with Jeju Base, US ships, submarines, and aircraft. There have already been visits by US warships, including a US nuclear aircraft carrier and a US nuclear submarine. On December 27th of last year, the South Korean media reported on a document responding to the North Korean nuclear crisis by a special committee of the ruling right-wing party. The document mentioned the necessity to examine the issue of making Jeju a strategic island in case of worsening situations. The document also mentioned examination of construction of a runway enabled for use by US strategic bombers and of establishment of temporary storage for nuclear weapons, as well as a promotion of those in the building of a new airport in Jeju. The new expressly militarized airport is currently in the proposal stage. The document also mentions the possibility of nuclear weapons being deployed in Japan, thus shared by the ROK, US, and Japan. On December 20th, bombers and fighters from 8 bases of the ROK, US, and Japan conducted a joint war drill in the Cadiz area southwest of Jeju. This January, the Center for Strategic and International Studies A conservative US think tank advised the US government to consider simulation training, which prepares for the redeployment of tactical nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula. While in February, a report from the Heritage Foundation, another conservative US think tank, suggested that there should be a NATO-type nuclear planning group with South Korea. These are dangerous steps toward the nuclearization of the Asia and Pacific, ignoring the treaty banning nuclear weapons. Jeju has many scars of imperialism, war, as well as the April 3rd massacre. Destined to fight unjust imperial domination and to contribute to world peace, we are here with all of you. Solidarity with you all. Let's save the earth together. My question to Noam: what do you want to tell the people of Jeju who are currently fighting against the Jeju Navy base, second airport, which will be highly likely to be an Air Force base project, and other just injustice? Why and how their struggles are important? Thank you.
The struggle of the people of Jeju Island has been a real inspiration. It's an amazing struggle against enormous odds for not only their own rights, preservation of this beautiful island that's being despoiled for military purposes and engaging them in military threats that'll threaten their existence, but also inspiration for struggles all over the world for freedom and solidarity and peace. What advice? Best advice is really for the countries, the others. Jeju Island, they're struggling courageously. They don't need any advice. It's the rest of us who need advice. Find ways to create solidarity, organizations, and activism, which will, first of all, learn about this struggle. Not many people know about it, and then move on to compel our own countries, for me, that primarily the United States, but others, to join in support for the just, honorable, courageous struggle of the people of Jeju Island for their own rights and for a major move towards global peace. Problem, the advice is for the outside. People of Jeju Island are giving us the advice by their own courageous struggle. We should take the advice and carry it forward in our own, wherever we are. It's an amazing achievement.
Thank you, Norman. Indeed, Jeju peace movement on those peace activists has been truly inspirational. And I'm just reading a statement you made a few years ago about Jeju. He said it was made clear that the purchase of the U.S. construction of a naval base on Jeju Island was also to exert military pressure on China and to place operational units on the front in preparation for a military conflict with China, which is your words. So Jeju Naval Base is the front of the United States.
The Biden administration attaches great importance to strengthening military alliances with other nations, describing allies as force multipliers. Asian countries are expected to fortify the U.S. encirclement of China and to provide logistical and combat support if the U.S. chooses to go to war. Put another way, in wartime, Asian nations are assigned the role of cannon fodder. American and Korean officials say their military alliance should not be confined to the Korean Peninsula, but must adopt a global role. In other words, the South Korean military must be willing to intervene anywhere in the region on behalf of the U.S., just as it did in the Vietnam War. And the second question I have is, do you feel that NATO seeing itself as having a role to play in the Asia Pacific increases the risk of war?
Well, on the second question, there's no doubt the existence of NATO increases the threat of war. Its expansion multiplies that effect. Expansion to the Indo-Pacific is an enormous step forward in the U.S. effort to dominate the entire world. NATO means the United States. The United States commands NATO. That means that the European countries are now enlisted in the U.S. preparation for confrontation, preparation for war with China, just as South Korea is enlisted by being occupied. The European countries are, in fact, partially occupied. Plenty of U.S. troops there, major U.S. bases. Ramstein base in Germany is used for U.S. operations in Africa, for example. You go visit the Ramstein base in Germany, you see planes taking off for U.S. operations in Africa. Go to Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean, you see planes, including nuclear-capable ones since Obama, bombing Central Asia and the Middle East. This is a global power, after all. There's a reason for those 800 military bases all over the world. And, of course, the United States wants to turn Okinawa, South Korea, into permanent military bases. As you say, exactly, the troops must be available to operate anywhere. Puts South Korea on the front line.
10 years ago, on the 60th anniversary of the signing of the armistice agreement, I met with a South Korean peace activist named Kang Jong-gu. And he said, 60 years represents a full lifetime. We have had a full lifetime of war. People may not understand that in the United States, but people in Korea understand that. And he said, isn't it high time that we, all the people, conclude peace through our own efforts? He said that 10 years ago. And he said something very interesting at that time, too. He spoke about South Korea's geostrategic utility to U.S. imperial designs. And he said, to reverse its loss of power, the United States has targeted global weak points. And he pointed out that the divided Korean peninsula, like the Middle East, was such a global weak point. And he pointed out how, as KJ was saying, North Korea serves as a stalking horse, a pretext, right? A ruse de guerre, right? And that the North Korea threat has justified successive war exercises between the United States, South Korea, Japan, India, and Australia, a kind of brutal solidarity there. And he said, from the perspective of US foreign policy, the divided Korean peninsula offers a flexible occasion for the staging of power transitions within the arena of global politics. Korea is very useful. Why? This is what he said. It can serve as a facilitator, a weakener, an accelerator, a delayer, and so on. And so the United States will not easily give up its perch as an occupier of South Korea. And how do we start to take measures? And people already have, but how do we strengthen the work that has been done to transform Asia and the Pacific into a people's Asia and a people's Pacific? You stated now, and I'm going to hold up this book, at the end of the 1970s, you actually, you stated something very interesting. So Greg, in his comments, stated that Asian nations right now have been assigned the role of cannon fodder. And you had some very interesting insight into this. You referred to these Asian nations that serve as cannon fodder as sub-fascist countries. And you said liberalism has accommodated well and contributed much to the institutionalization of sub-fascism under US tutelage. the sub-fascist dynamic is alive and well.
I wanted to kind of close to wrap up the webinar, and I want to read just what report that Noam's statement reported actually in the Korean media. That was under Noam Wi-hyun progressive president's administration. This was Noam, when you were looking at the time the Inter-Korean rapprochement, you said progress on the Korean Peninsula marks a turning point in 500 years of a Western rule. And you said we are creating a new paradigm that leads to independence through unity and integration, overcoming the structure of a division and disintegration, which was the typical method of aggression, domination, and governance by Western and American colonialists for 5 centuries. Tremendous positive changes on the Korean Peninsula will lead to another concrete step forward toward a unified nation. We sincerely congratulate and rejoice that progress is being made in the cause of a reunification and through ceaseless efforts and resistance. At this point, it is not an easy time, but I think that it shows possibilities in this challenging time. Noam, any last words that can inspire us? We can carry on our struggle together.
The only important words are, it can be done. We have to do it. We can do it. Let's get to work.
Indeed. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Chomsky, and our distinguished discussants. And thank you, everyone, for attending today's webinar. In today's webinar, we covered many issues, and we especially wanted to focus on implications, ramifications of Washington's new Cold War on the Korean Peninsula. And it's time to stop the war and the Korean War, sign a peace treaty, and stop this new Cold War. After discussing all this information, we also learned that it's important to work together, renew our struggle, and fight back. And it is possible. Another world is possible. If you have any other questions, please, you can also contact me. I will also, of course, I will be happy to answer your, and also share the question to Professor Chomsky. Thank you, JSTV, who's co-sponsored today's webinar, and our discussants, our friends, amazing activists, and also, of course, Noam. Thank you so much, and thank you to those who joined through YouTube stream live and also Zoom. And thank you so much for joining us today, and have a wonderful rest of the day and evening. Thank you. Good night.
Wonderful to be with you.
더 나은 세상을 위해 공정한 언론의 역할을 다하고자 노력하는 JSTV는 전 제작진의 자발적인 참여로 만들어지는 독립 언론이자 대한 매체입니다. 방송이 마음에 드셨다면 응원의 표시로 지금 좋아요, 구독 버튼을 눌러주세요. 감사합니다.